Hi, everybody. My name is Paul Beaman, and I'm the director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society here at UVic. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to our 7th Scholars in the Square lecture of 2025. Just a quick word about format, which will be a bit different for those of you who are familiar with our Scholars in the Square series. Here, Lori Beaman and Doug Ezzy will engage in a dialogue about end-of-life care. Specifically, they're interested in the ways the growing number of non-religious people might alter the way we need to talk about and think about this sort of care. After they're finished their conversation, we'll open the floor for a broader conversation about this issue with the folks in the room and those of you who are joining us on Zoom. I should also say that this presentation is the beginning of 2 days of discussions among about a dozen of us, or a little more, scholars and practitioners with an interest in end-of-life care. Some of us are local, some of us are from away, most of us are actually here, and some of us are only virtually here. Regardless of your here-ness, I'd like to welcome all of our visitors to our beautiful campus, city, and community. Now, as part of noting to whom we owe our first and largest debt of gratitude, I'd like to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, Songhees, and Esquimalt peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanish peoples whose historical relationships the land continue to this day. Now, our workshop is part of Lori's extremely large $2.5 million multi-year international research project called Nonreligion in a Complex Future. Today we feature 2 speakers. Starting from the Southern Hemisphere, I'm happy to welcome Dr. Doug Ezzy, who is again behind that backpack on the screen. Doug is a professor of sociology at the University of Tasmania and a co-investigator on Lori's NCR. Doug works on the sociology of religion, nature, and health. His books include LGBT Christians and Reinventing Church. And joining us from the frozen ice fortress that is Ottawa and Montreal, this doctor, I have to say that because I'm from Winnipeg, in Canadian religious studies settings, Dr. Lori Beaman is a fixture, a pillar, a giant by reputation and CV, and yet completely disarming and warm in person, as you're about to find out. She's the author or editor of a great many books that are really kind of required reading for scholars of religion in Canada, including A Transition of Religion to Culture in Law and Public Discourse in 2020, and everyone's favorite, Deep Equality in the Era of Diversity in 2018. So please join me in welcoming Lori and to Victoria and to Scholars in the Square.
Thanks, everyone. It's great to see you. I think I recognize some faces too, some new faces who have come in, who are old friends. I want to start by thanking Paul and Center and Rachel for inviting us to come and do our workshop here, and then inviting/insisting that Doug and I should give a talk. So we're grateful for this opportunity. We're grateful to have the time to spend with you and to talk a little bit about this particular area of research in which we're engaged. I want to say a word about this kind of weird format, and that is, when we were negotiating, okay, what would we talk about and how do we do this? And it's like, well, what if you could talk and what if you could respond? And someone was like, no, it has to be a joint talk. And there's a reason for that, because this project, Nonreligion in a Complex Future project, is truly collaborative. And Doug and I walk and talk and think together a great deal. And I wanted the talk to reflect that walking, talking, and thinking together. But the other thing that I want to be sure to say is that this is a partnership grant, a Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada partnership grant. But the partnership is with a number of organizations, including the Center, but also it's truly collaborative. There's nothing that we'll talk about that hasn't been produced by collaborative research, conversations. A number of people who are in the room have contributed to that. They're part of the team. Paul's part of the team. Joel's part of the team. I hate doing this because I know I forget somebody in there. It's not that I'm overlooking you. Hina is part of the team. She's worked on a couple of the projects. There are a number of people, and I did want to give and Cheryl. So see, this is the trouble with naming people. And I did want to give a special mention to Chris Miller, because Chris Miller has been a postdoctoral fellow who has worked with us, especially in the health area of the project. The health area, it turns out, has been all about death and dying, because what better site to think about religion and non-religion than death and dying. And Chris has done incredible work to keep the field work moving along. He's done some of the field work himself. He's done some analysis with some of the data we have. He's just really been a collaborator in the full sense of the word on this. So I wanted to say thank you so much, Chris, too. It is a project that is, again, truly collaborative, not to overstate the whole thing. So, Doug, are we ready?
Yes.
All right. After I've said all that, I want to start our paper, How Non-Religion Changes End of Life Care. So first thing, maybe obvious, is that religion can no longer provide the only meaningful framework within which we can understand life, end of life. And so we're interested in how the religious, and sometimes I'll say non-religious, but I'd like you to imagine this sort of a little bracket with non and then religious, because we're trying to talk about these two things at once. Non-religious landscape is changing, the religious landscape is changing, and the Non-Religion and Complex Future Project is exploring how this change is impacting, social impact of it, through the exploration of obituaries. For example, in Canada alone, we have over 3,000, we've collected over 3,000 obituaries over a 100-year period, to start thinking about what do we see happening in those obituaries that tells us something about how society is changing about its ideas about death and dying. And again, Chris has done some really interesting analysis on that. He's published an article on that with a couple of the other people on the team, and we haven't finished the analysis of anything yet. So this is just an opportunity to start to think more about it. We're talking with death doulas, hospice workers. We've done death cafes research, 9 focus groups, 30 interviews in Canada alone. Never mind elsewhere, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. So today what we want to do is we want to do a few things. First, we're going to talk briefly about the social landscape, the changing social landscape for religion. Then we'll talk about very briefly about some findings from another project that is maybe going to tell us a little bit about how we're thinking about this one. We will talk about the complexity of non-religious identities, and we will introduce the idea of a space of becoming in between religion and non-religion. And what we want to do is, in a sense, identify the binary of religion and non-religion and argue that what we're thinking about is something in between. And naming that space is difficult, but we have called it a space of becoming for this little bit of an experiment today, taking inspiration from William Conway's work, The World of Becoming, as he describes it. This space is pluralistic, it's symbolically pluralistic, especially as Doug likes to remind me rather frequently. It's a space of becoming. It involves relationships, ethics, and it resists certainty. This is another important part. And it includes things like afterlife imaginaries. And we'll talk a little bit about those. We'll talk about some of those relationships. And what we conclude, I suppose, if it can give you the sort of punchline, is that relationships are primary. It's relationships that matter. And we've seen some of that this afternoon in our conversation in our workshop, at which many of you were present and haven't necessarily had a chance to be at, but I can tell you that we've talked a lot about relationships, especially for dying people and caregiving of dying people. So Doug, over to you. Do you want to talk a bit? Where's my button here? Sure. Spirituality. Yeah, we get Australia coming to us.
So just a few comments to start with. Again, to reinforce what Laurie's just said, I really appreciate the collaborative nature of this and the way that we've been trusting each other to work together and create new ways of understanding. It's a pleasure. And I also particularly wanted to acknowledge the Brazilian and Argentinian participants. I think it was great wisdom of Laurie to include those people, and it's been great to have conversations with them, to have them as conversational partners in our thinking. So there's a couple of wallabies from Tasmania that I saw on my walk not long ago. Um, Spirituality. We don't talk much about spirituality in this paper, and there's a few reasons for that. One of them is that most of our participants don't use the term spirituality, so it's an empirical um, response where we're using the language of our participants. But there's also some more general problems with this, particularly with the growing numbers of non-religious people. In Australia, there have been a few studies where medical practitioners have tried to introduce, spiritual care um, pro formas or practices into end-of-life care. And what they found when they did this, and admittedly they're small studies and more work needs to be done on it, but quite a few Australians objected to this. They didn't like saying that you need spiritual care. Now, that doesn't mean they don't need all the things that go with it, a sense of purpose and companionship and relationship and those sorts of things. But the word spirituality can be problematic for a variety of ways. Sometimes the word spirituality can point at the things that we're talking about in a space of becoming. And Bruce Rumbold's work, for example, does this really nicely when he talks about prioritizing the thoughts, memories, and experiences of the patient. It sort of draws us into that space. But one of the problems that we have with spirituality is we think it draws us back into the religion, non-religion binary. I was really interested by Isabella Kostiecki's comments that maybe it's getting beyond that, and I think that's worth exploring. But for the point of this paper, we don't use it. Next slide, please. So here's some survey statistics. It's the only survey statistics in the paper from both the ISSP. There's a bunch of studies that were done around 2018 and from the Australian OSA survey. And the larger data set is much larger. I think there's about 30 countries. But what I just wanted to give you, those surveys have what religion were you brought up in? And then what is your religion now? And you can see that there's a few countries where Australia and the UK at the top there, where about 50% of the people who were brought up Christian are now non-religious. That's just a massive change in the religious demography of those places. And then there's a bunch of other countries, France, Switzerland, Spain, Germany, United States, Norway, sort of, mainly European countries. Not sure whether Canada would fit in that group. I guess it would. That somewhere between 20 and 40% of those who are brought up Christian are now non-religious. So there's this sort of massive transition away from religious identities. In those countries, in most of those countries where a lot of people are becoming non-religious, about 1 to 2% of the population go from being non-religious or other religions to Christianity. So it's basically negligible in terms of the big picture transition that we're talking about here. Most people who are brought up non-religious stay non-religious. The other thing that's, I think, worth noting about this table is the final column, the percentage of the population that were brought up Christian. And this is a point that, and this is certainly the case for the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project, most of the countries that we're looking at, Christianity was hegemonic. So the residue of Christianity remains really significant in shaping the experiences and the culture and the understanding of the people and the experiences that we're looking at.
Over to
Next
me?
slide. Yes.
Okay, I'm going to wait on the slide. So what does it mean to be non-religious? Somebody asked if I could speak up who's online. I just want to say I'm doing my best. I got here after 3 attempts yesterday, so I'm feeling a little bit wobbly after midnight arrival, and which was kind of 2-3 a.m. body time, but I'll try to shout. So what does it mean to say you're non-religious? So we've considered this complex question or issue in our research on community gardens. Lessons from the Community Garden Project. We've conducted 134 interviews in 48 gardens in Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, Finland, Norway, United Kingdom, and the United States. And what's striking about the community gardeners when we say, ask them about religion, which we do toward the end of our conversation with them, is the ambiguity, the complexity, and the uncertainty of their responses. So they are their responses are neither they're not straightforward, I guess I should say. Categorizing our participants as either religious or non-religious is simply too simplistic. So I went through the interviews. We had a little chart, and I was like, okay, let's figure this out: religious, non-religious. And I went through the interviews, and I thought, uh-oh. And the more I got into it, the more I thought, this is really not a possible task. And that's when we started to talk about the complexity of this as a category, these two categories. And as I said, it's just too simplistic. The binary approach misrepresents a significant number of the people who were in this particular study, and the binary does not capture the subtle ebbs and flows of many participants' lives, something that sociologists of religion, for example, have known for a long time, but still insist on categorization. So this is the case for both those who identified as religious and those who identified as not religious. And Doug has already mentioned that the entanglement of most of the societies that we're studying around Christianity means that Christianity, though, still frames some of the responses, and the residual Christianity. Here we're drawing on the ideas of our dear friend David Seljak, and thinking about, well, what is the impact of that? And so how do people describe their awe and experiences, awe, wonder, enchantment, and experiences in the garden? So we have a quote here from Petri, who's from Finland, that kind of exemplifies what it is we're trying. We have a number of longish quotes, but again, we want to try to capture the complexity of what we're seeing rather than just stuffing people into categories. So I don't think I'm religious. I think I'm religious, in the same sense. And if this is something like yes, no, then yes, I do. Well, yes, in the sense that I'm interested in quite a lot of different beliefs, and I'm not religious in the sense that I go to church or follow a particular religion. I'm not religious in that way. But then again, I'm fascinated by the questions and the interaction between people in many ways. And that's because the stories that are related to religions are quite, in many ways, shared stories. And through them, people choose what they do, in what way they are, and in what way they are with each other. So then it is interesting to kind of understanding something about the stories, at least to know what it talks about. So religiosity, is a pretty kind of such a broad concept for me. And we left a lot of the hesitation and the repetition in this because we want to try to capture this, like, oh my gosh, these people have asked me about religion. And I don't feel I'm terribly against it, but rather that I find it fascinating to see how people are there and in what way they do things, and then kind of accept it. I'm also happy to be involved in that activity, even though I don't belong to a church myself. I'm not religious in that way, but then again, my own way, I feel that I am. So can you tell me why I had trouble going yes or no in the boxes I was trying to stuff this person in? So she's resisting the religion, non-religion binary. And this is the most common response in our interviews, but not everybody is quite as articulately inarticulate as Petri is. Only a small number of people articulate their own position in terms of either a sacred canopy of religious belief and practice or a complete rejection of it. So Petri is interested in religion, but that's through shared stories. People choose what they do and what way they are and what way they are with others. Those shared stories are not universal truths, but rather narratives of shared human experiences. It's the relationships that matter in the stories, as mentioned by Petri, not beliefs and meaning, but acting, relationships, and shared experiences. Doug, over to you and beyond the binary.
Thanks, Laurie. The next slide. So, part of the problem, I think, with a lot of theory here is it tends to keep drawing us back into this binary and editing out the middle space. So often when you talk about religion, non-religion, people tend to think of non-religion as Dawkins-esque materialism, and religion as some sort of transcendental true believer confident in the other world. And this sort of binary edits out that middle space. The materialists tend to dismiss the symbolic or emotional forms of communication, And at the other end, you get Christians who tend to interpret any sort of symbolic or emotional ideas as somehow a yearning for Christianity or for true belief. And that way of thinking, and I think it's both theoretical and cultural, tends to edit out this middle ground, like a sort of palimpsest, where the thing gets written over. Now, the important thing to say about this is not what we see in our data. Most of the people that we interviewed in the community gardens and in the trekking project, and now increasingly in the end of life care project, hold more complex positions. And I think one way of thinking about this could be using Latour's concept of purification, where he talks about how the hybrids tend to be hidden and ignored, and culture purifies things into binaries. And it's not simply that the middle ground is more pluralistic, where the two overlap, if you like. It's an otherwise space, or an other than the religion, non-religion. A space of becoming is the term that we've used. And Petrie's quote indicates this so beautifully. She values different things that the binary ignores. Things like openness, generosity, curiosity, things like this that are sort of central to it and that embrace messiness and contradiction and vulnerability. It's a different type of space to that gets articulated in the religion, non-religion binary. Next slide. That's Tasmania only has one deciduous indigenous tree, and that's one of them. One of the things that we see in our data in all of the studies is the importance of relationship. For our participants, they emphasize relationships both with other humans and with the other than human. Laurie often objects when I use the word community because it tends to draw us back into this idea of human community. And for our participants, their sense of community is both human and other than human, those sorts of horizontal relationships that draw them out. For trekkers and hikers, this is often an experience of intimacy with the place where they're walking. Whereas with gardeners, they often find themselves entangled in relationships with animals and plants in the garden. It's a less Cartesian and Platonist way of thinking. I like to say to my students, Descartes was so wrong, so very, very wrong when he said, I think, therefore I am. That's not how we become human. Martin Buber says, in the beginning is the relationship. We find ourselves in relationships and we discover and understand ourselves in those relationships. And it's a more hermeneutic and relational ontology and epistemology, to use the big words, but it comes out of the experience of the people. This is what they're telling us. There's also a different ethical theory, I think, that comes out of this. I'm writing about this in another project. It's not Kantian deontology or utilitarianism. It's more Levinasian relational ethics or a feminist ethics of care. The ethics comes out of the practice of the relationship, not out of belief or commitment to abstract ideas. Now, we're making theoretical arguments here, but these ideas are coming out of the empirical observations of the people that we see, of the voices of our participants. Laurie.
I'm up. So what does all of this have to do with death, dying, and end-of-life care? So I want to think for a minute about the space of becoming imaginary of the afterlife. So far, just to sort of bring us to where we are, we've argued that the non-religious landscape is changing. There's a tendency in social statistics and academic analysis to think about in binaries, religious or not religious. This is problematic. We've given a brief snapshot of our community gardens research to demonstrate the nuanced and complex ways that people talk about their relationship to religion and non-religion. We've argued that there's an important middle ground into which many people fall that is understudied and not necessarily well articulated. We've observed that relationships are primary in that space, and that it's through those ethical practices that ethical practices emerge and are expressed. We've introduced the concept of a space of becoming as a description of this middle space. We now turn specifically to this middle space in relation to dying and end-of-life care. So I want to just briefly talk about the research that Chris and I have done. We've written an article on this, and we looked at the ways in which people imagine the afterlife. Chris could probably say this more coherently than I can right now. So we've written on afterlife imaginaries from our Death Cafe focus groups and interviews, specifically in Canada. We haven't analyzed the data from anywhere else. It's simply we said, wow, we've got some really fantastic data from Canada. Let's do something with it. Let's think about what we're seeing. And we were inspired by the work of Crystal Manning, who had done some work to identify 3 afterlife imaginaries. Hers were lights out, recycling, and mystery. And we sort of, sociologists do this, we always want to reinvent words, even when that's not necessary at all. But so we sort of added, cessation, lights out, energy, recycling, unknown, mystery, and transition. Our category of, lights out is fairly self-explanatory. Energy was a little bit more complicated than our version of energy, a little bit more complicated than Crystal Manning's was, in that we had this sort of material scientific version of my body or I am recycled and decomposed and so on. And then we had something what's a little bit less materialistic, a little more like, well, there's an energy. There's this sort of way in which my energy circulates. It wasn't quite the same as the material. Transition, the 4th category, was a bit more nuanced as well, although there was still this kind of coherent sense of self that moves on. Unknown and mystery is fairly straightforward as well, I should say. So the transition category maintained a more coherent sense of self, but it didn't equate to what I sometimes call the heavenly harp imaginary, where I go off and, there's angels and harps in heaven. So there was a bit more uncertainty in the transition category. And so too with it, there was a bit more certainty, in the transition category and with the cessation category as well. But most people seem to fall in that in-between place of energy recycling and unknown mystery. So in our end of life care data, many of our participants are comfortable in this kind of middle ground that was characterized by some ambiguity. Amy, for example, who's a participant in the Death Cafe's research from Australia, reports that in the Death Cafe she participated in, they had a discussion of whether there's an afterlife. And she said, so it's the place where those kinds of questions get asked and those things get talked about in a non-pressured, non-focused, non-precious kind of way. And her point isn't that they don't believe or do believe in something. It's that they dwell in the possibility of something unknown, of mystery, of energy. There's a sort of way in which I would call it a humility in thinking about what actually happens. So there's a sort of way in which people dwell, as I said, in that. So our argument is that this articulates the space of becoming that's beyond the religion, non-religion binary. As in our community gardens research, we see relationships here emerging as primary in our imaginaries of the afterlife. So this is Carolyn, a Death Cafe participant from Australia. Oh gosh, what happens when we die? Well, there's the physical stuff. So if I have a heart attack out on the street, the ambulance will be called and I'll be sent off to one of the major hospitals and end up in the morgue. She dies. And family will be called and they'll take it from there. I think because I've been with, I don't know how many hundreds of people, I've been at the bedside of the death over the years. She works in palliative care. I think it's not something that I fear. There's been a lot of stuff on near-death experiences where you go into the light. I see with a great majority of patients have died, they generally see people, their loved ones there. I would ask, who is that? Most likely the dead ones will be there. But there's no proof of that. But that's what I believe anyway. I don't hold with the Christian idea of going to heaven or hell. But I think there is this sort of going into the light. I think there has to be a point to life and suffering. I think we kind of go somewhere with all the other dead ones. But again, there's absolutely no evidence for that. I think everybody's got to find their own meaning in life and to death and to suffering. There's no universal answer to that. So relationships are central to Carolyn's account of afterlife. She points to relationships in terms of the physical stuff. Family will be called. She also points to relationships in the afterlife. They generally see people. people, their loved ones. The sense of meaning and an ethics of care comes out of the relationships. That is what's important. She resists both the desire to explain away the experience and the certainty of knowing. There's no evidence, but she talks respectfully about the experiences, not dismissively. The space of becoming is one in which people notice and prioritize relationships, not belief. In that space, they hold on to possibilities that are rich with emotional depth and significance. They both resist the certainties of a universal answer and embrace the meaning to be found in the stories people tell about their experiences while dying. Doug.
So here's a quote from Amy, another Death Cafe participant in Australia. And apologies for the strong language at the end of this. We never really got into any sort of afterlife kind of conversation in the death cafes that I was at. I don't know why that is. Part of me just longs to be a believer. After my partner's death, immediately I was wishing I was, I think she said Torajan, which is an Indonesian indigenous ethnic group that maintains long relationships with the dead. So I could stay near my partner's body for the next year. We have these hands-off things about death and also a dismissive attitude about the presence of spirits. My problem is that I've got a very Western, rational, materialist brain. So even in those times when I feel like maybe there is something, my brain starts going, bing! I really wish it would shut up. So if that conversation ever came up at the Death Cafe, I would probably be all over it. I do know that early on when my partner died, I was living in a state in the US, which is very Southern Baptist, and quite a few people were, he's in a better place and God took his angel, that kind of thing. And I was like, seriously, fuck God. Just don't even say that to me. I did actually yell at one woman who I told not to say this stuff because it really, I know that you mean to help, but it really hurts. And she wouldn't stop. And if that's what God wanted, then fuck him. I walked away. Honestly, it's like I gave you a warning, lady. And now, the point here isn't that Amy believes or doesn't believe. The point is that she dwells in the possibility, and the possibility is comforting and meaningful to her. Amy here talks quite respectfully and is even intrigued about the possibility of an afterlife. The hurtful nature of the better place narrative is not the possibility of an afterlife, it's the simplistic certainty. That's what's bothering her. She articulates three quite different things. She's fascinated with an afterlife, she has a strong rationalist, materialist approach to the world, and she's hurt by simplistic assurances. So she's resisting both extreme materialism, we might call that evangelical atheism, but she's also resisting the heavenly heart transcendentalism. She's searching for something in that messy in-between space, the space of becoming. It's not coherent meaning that she's searching for. She explicitly rejects those frameworks. Rather, for Amy, the meaning is found in the space of becoming. She's searching for how to find a way of relating to her now deceased partner in stories of possibilities. Next slide. In a systematic review of research on end-of-life dreams and visions, Hessian found that 77% of patients who were conscious at the end of life had dreams and visions. And some of these get talked about in by doulas and hospice care workers. I'll quote that in a minute. Is the next slide the one that deals with the quote, Laurie?
Yeah, you want it now?
No.
Just wanted to know.
It's just playing.
Yeah.
Just a little bit.
Keep going, Doc.
It's the experience that matters in these. So if somebody like has a vision of a predeceased relative, you don't either tell them that they're hallucinating or that you can be certain it's real. It's the thing that people value is the relationship. And Kerr, in a review of this research, found that it was most oftenly the predeceased relatives that people had visions of were people who loved them unconditionally. Now I'll do the quote, Laurie. But I couldn't understand what she was saying. And I said, I'm sorry, what did you say? and the dying person goes, "Not you." And she pushed me out of the way to talk to whoever was behind that. The room was
Doug.
empty. It was just me.
Doug,
Yeah?
stop you. We're missing a slide.
No,
Go back one. That was it.
Yep.
There you go.
Okay, there. Sorry.
Okay. You couldn't see what
Yeah, sorry.
it's very, oh, I see what happened. All right. Yes. Apologies. Will I read out this one? Yes. It's
Yeah.
very common at the end of life for people to have visions. Anecdotally, they are overwhelmingly visions that are comfortable. They are visions of ancestors and relatives that have passed before them, and they often provide people with a deep sense of comfort and connection. Whatever the visitation they're receiving or experience, it's just like a mandate to facilitate it, unless it's negative. But in my experience, that's not been the case. The next one, Laurie?
There. Did you cover all that?
Yeah, I see. So we missed that one. Yes, all right. Keep going.
Backwards. Okay. I'm doing.
So you're on the
two. Yeah, you took the slide. Okay. So the positive impact of these visions can be striking. Kimberly trained as a nurse and a death stool in a small cafe in Nova Scotia, or in a small community. She might have trained in a cafe too, in Nova Scotia. She tells the story of a patient she had who had been completely nonverbal, in much of the time during their relationship. One day she was giving this patient a sponge bath and the patient started talking to her. Here's Kimberly again. I couldn't understand what she was saying. And I said, "I'm sorry, what did you say?" And she goes, "Not you." And she pushed me out of the way to talk to whoever was behind that. The room was empty. It was just me. And so I was like, "I'm really sorry." And then I went to the other side of the bed because I didn't want my back to be to whoever she was talking to. I was like, I don't want to interfere with this. And then, yeah, she was glowing and so excited about "Oh, it's you." And she was just having this wonderful conversation with whoever it was who was with her. Right. And so I was like, okay, I'm not going to mess with this. Right. And this was my first experience with this bedside thing. And that changed me forever. Right. So Kimberly explained that this experience had changed her and how she thinks about what happens after death. She says, death can't be the last thing. Death can't be lasting forever. And there's got to be something that happens afterward. I don't know. And that was the and again, that was the biggest thing that has forever stuck with me. I think it's my favorite one because it freaked me out so much. So one response to Kimberly might focus on her thoughts about the afterlife and whether she believes or is yearning for belief. And we think this response misses the significance of Kimberly's experience. Rather, the point is that Kimberly's patient had a vivid experience that was positive and profoundly transformative. The patient went from nonverbal to glowing. At the heart of that experience was a relationship with some unspecified other who was clearly deeply significant to this patient. What Kimberly takes from this is a transformed respect for these types of experiences. Whether or not she believes or whether she should believe is not central to her concerns. Rather, her reflections combine the suggestion that there's got to be something after that death, and I don't know. This uncertainty is underlined by Kimberly's repeated words and hesitancy, which we've left in the quote above. Actually, I cleaned it up and then Doug put them back in because he's like, "Oh no." Okay, so belief or not is not the issue here. Rather, relationships articulated through symbolically rich experiences are at issue. It is this that gives the patient hope and comfort in a difficult time, and this is the space of becoming. Death, Doug, death. Over to
you. Next slide, Laurie. Have we got the right one?
Okay, let's see. Yeah, go.
I've not seen a deathbed visitation from a loved one while I was there. However, they did tell me afterwards that they had seen their loved ones. It's been a very comforting to the person. They were very lucid. They were not dreamy and maybe like they hadn't quite woke up. They were very lucid and very calmly explaining about the fact that they had this visit with their sister, who they also know is dead. They understand that the person is dead and not physically there. And it's not like, oh, they viewed it as this mystic thing. It's always been very matter of fact. Oh, I saw my sister, blah, blah, blah. And a lot of times it's portrayed as this ethereal thing. But the people are just very matter of fact. I have heard other people in care facilities have asked people, are you seeing the angels? I don't think that the people that I've encountered would have referred to these people as angels. They just referred to it as they visited their loved one. But yeah, without a doubt, they have all been very happy encounters or totally matter of fact. But they've been, I would say, but they have never been, I would say, on the bad end of the scale. So she resists an interpretation of predeceased relatives as either mystical or as angels. For her, the people have these visions, are experiencing them as a matter of fact. It's almost mundane. Notice too that her argument is built on empirical experience, what people have told her. She doesn't make an argument from what she believes or what people should believe or what people shouldn't believe. It's this is what happens to people. This is their experiences. The next slide. And being heard is really crucial to these experiences, the sense that they're being respected and understood. Kimberly, a death doula, elaborates, so like they just want to talk, like they just need an ear that's not going to be like, I heard stories 100 times, but I never heard them. Even if I'm 50, even if I'm 50 times, tell me again because they just want to talk. And then Amy from Australia says, for me, it was just trying to find a place where I could talk about an experience that is not really an easy conversation to have socially. Early on in my grief, people were very sensitive and very willing to talk. But after a while, I felt like grandmother death walking into a kind of party. That's interesting contrast with the prior funeral thing that we saw earlier, where it was the opposite of this. But anyway, but I still wanted to have the conversation. And one of the things I loved about the Death Cafe was not only was it welcome, it was expected. That's what we were there to talk about. And it was death or grief or whatever. And any of those conversations were welcome. It was just a big sense of relief actually being there. Now, I don't want to get into the debate about whether Australia or Canada or other places are death-denying societies. We don't think that's particularly helpful. I don't think they are, but I think there's sort of a complex negotiation of what's going on there. But what we want to point to is how both Kimberly and Amy emphasize the importance of being heard. Being heard is key to the space of becoming for both dying and bereaved people, because the aim is to find ourselves in relationships of respect. There's lots more about this in the data, but in the interest of time, back to Laurie.
So rituals and remembering. The space of becoming is also found in rituals that are beyond the religion, non-religion binary. Oh, sorry, Doug, you had 2 slides there. We're messing up the slides. I think you've already summarized this.
I have. Next one.
Okay. So on rituals, this is Karen from Australia, and she was someone again who participated in death cafes. And Karen says, I would say the first year after the first celebration after my husband died, an Australian friend said, let's go somewhere and we'll go for a swim, go somewhere near water. So definitely near water. And then we went to this Gothic church that my husband was not religious and didn't like churches, but he always told me about this beautiful pilgrimage church. And I went there with her. And so actually, that was a little bit of a ritual then of lighting a candle and things, I guess. Even though we're not religious, there was something special. And then last year, we went out on a ferry. Not that there are many ferries, and she names the city we de-identified, but on the water again, because I guess doing something that he liked to do. Having it, I would say, for me, fairly quiet. Having it, I would say, for me, fairly quiet and being with people where you feel secure, because I think you could feel quite fragile. So it's nice to feel comfortable. And my friend was really great in that. She said, if you decide you don't want to do anything, that's fine. We just won't do anything. So you're not under pressure. And because my husband's ashes went into the Baltic Sea, so they're out there in the water. So Karen's point is that her practices of remembering helped her to manage a sense of being fragile. Reading into what she says is almost as if the ritual practices hold her memories of her husband and allow her to experience the sadness of a loss alongside finding a way for her to live well with memories of him. We don't see her church visitation as yearning toward a religious worldview. Rather, we note that her husband both didn't like churches and told her about a beautiful pilgrimage church. Again, that sort of ambiguous space. The next year, she went on a ferry as part of her remembrance ritual. A religious space, a church, we might say, is part of this, but Karen's ritual practice is beyond the binary. The role of continuing bonds in bereavement is well established in the literature. And the thing that we really want to say about this is that used to be, we'd see severing the bond as kind of part of healing. But now we're seeing in the literature, bereaved people do not sever the bonds with significant people who've died, and where past theory or our ideas about this suggest that they should. Rather, people continue attachment, albeit in new circumstances. So we think this point about the importance of relationships holds equally for bereavement for the practice of care for dying people. Doug, accompaniment.
Next slide. Yep, next slide. And we're going to have to speed it up a bit, Laurie, or we're going to run out of time.
I can't talk any faster, Doug.
So this is a quote from Phoebe, and I'll just read out the bold bit. And I would say even in many of the palliative care centres, there's a lack of accompaniment for dying people. So there are chaplains, but not for someone that doesn't, have an active spiritual practice. It's still not an accompaniment. She talks more generally about the problem with that. The next slide, Laurie. So what we see in our data is that dying people are looking for companionship, for relationships. And I think Ellis and Lloyd Williams make a really interesting point about this. It's often assumed that religious training in a religious tradition gives people expertise in dealing with that. But people aren't looking for discussion of what happens in the afterlife or certainty about belief. What they're looking for is a sense of being with them through the experience of suffering. And they say expertise in dealing with people who are facing a life-threatening illness. So religious questions are increasingly irrelevant to dying people. So that's not the expertise that's required here. Laurie, back to you.
Okay. So what matters to dying people? What we're describing is an incredibly difficult dimension of life and death. Not transcendent, not material. In her experiences with people in the active dying phase, Ellen, a participant in the Death Cafe research in Australia, exhibits both curiosity and humility. And here's Ellen. My experience working with some of the travelers, and I would call them a traveler, they're not a patient to me or a client or whatever. That's the term I use with them. Having watched travelers journey through that active dying phase and finally physically dying, there's so much more that happens in that space that I can't explain. That's incredibly beautiful, very fragile. It's just, I have such a curiosity around that, and I want to learn more so I understand as much as I can. And that learning doesn't come from books, it comes from people and listening to conversations and understanding and being with the calling and the reaching out and the stories and the watching my mother go through active dying. When that veil becomes thin between worlds, it's an incredibly beautiful space. I don't have a particular religious alignment. If it was anything, it would be to be kind and compassionate to one another, just simply that. The world needs a little bit more of that. So in terms of a religious, I don't have a heaven, I don't have that. I don't have that. We're going to go caught the wrath of hell or whatever. Notice how Ellen points to relationships and stories, both her own and those of the dying person, and experiences as the source of her understanding. That learning doesn't come from books, it comes from people and listening. She embraces compassion and generosity. More, embracing the fragility of the experience is the source of the beauty she finds. That's incredibly beautiful, very fragile. She doesn't have a particular religious alignment, but she does talk respectfully about the veil when the veil becomes thin between the worlds. Again, she's resisting certainty and embracing a curiosity about the experience. In many of our interviews, we see participants embracing a mystery, to go back to the research that Chris and I did. So who was I? In the space of dying, a good death is linked, said one of the death doulas we've interviewed, to a good life. And this has been a theme all afternoon in our conversations together. This involves an exploration of the person's experiences, relationships, and images of themselves and their lives. And Isabel talked about the Elvis image, for example. So I'm a huge fan of visualization, says Ashley. So I'll have them, if they went to Hawaii every year, it's like, okay, tell me what it was like from the moment you got off the plane, and what did the breeze felt like, and what was it about Hawaii? What was the smell like? Where did you stay? What did you like to do? And then we try to visualize it. And that could be going through pictures, or there was one person and I brought some sand for them so they could feel the sand and some seashells and, little things like that. Rowan, a death doula in Canada, recalled working with the patient at the end of his life and later attending his end of life ceremony. When he looked at the photo album at that ceremony, he remembered thinking, I was like, whoa, what a swarthy man compared to the client that I met. I was like, oh, now I see like, and I did what everyone else does, which was I took the person before me to be the person that this man was, that he thought he wasn't. I don't think he identified as much with this more vulnerable dying self. This situates the needs of the dying person in the here and the now. Who was I? What was I? Who was this person? Rather than here's where you're going, here's where he's going. Rowan and Ashley celebrate the content of a person's life in the present. And they do that in a symbolically rich way through visualization and photos. Doug.
Next slide, Laurie. So here's the UK Standards for Hospice and Palliative Care Chaplaincy description of spiritual care. Spiritual care needs to be assessed and addressed, exploring an individual's sense of meaning and purpose in life, attitudes, beliefs, values, ideas, and values. And the last one I find particularly problematic, the why questions in relation to life, death, and suffering. I think these ways of framing, we think these ways of framing what people need in end-of-life care largely misunderstands what is important for non-religious people and many religious people in the end-of-life care. We do like the suggestion about encouraging reminiscing and exploring hopes and fears. However, we think that the other suggestions will be increasingly problematic in the context of growing numbers of people who are non-religious and growing numbers of religious people who are not heavenly true believers. In our end-of-life care data, people are typically not seeking meaning and purpose. Belief and values are not that important to them. Also, largely irrelevant is the problem of evil, the why question about suffering. The problem of evil is a distinctive product of a strong monotheistic conception of the world and a belief in an all-loving, all-powerful God. Beliefs that no longer hold very many people tightly, so it's not an important question. Rather, what is important is a sense of meaningful companionship. By meaning, we do not mean shared worldviews or beliefs, rather meaning emerges in symbolically rich experiences of the space of becoming, such as touching sand brought in by a caregiver, or a vision of a predeceased relative, or a story of what might happen after death. What is important about these end-of-life experiences is not the worldview and understanding they articulate. Rather, what's important is the sense that they are shared, that people find themselves in relationships of care. Next slide, Laurie.
No, Doug.
No?
Okay.
No.
No.
Oh, okay. No, back to the other one then. Yes.
Keep talking, Doug.
That's right. So in conclusion, in our community gardens and trekking interviews, we found that horizontal and relational concerns were central. And just to underline, these are huge data sets that Laurie and I are working with. The Community Gardens is like 135 interviews, and trekking is, I don't know, 120, something like that. It's a really large data set and it's incredibly diverse. And across all of that data, we see this coming out again and again. The and these horizontal and relational concerns we're seeing in our early studies of death cafes, obituaries, and hospice care workers and death doulas. Not only is this a more egalitarian sense of the human place in the world, it is more grounded and immanent. Our interviewees have a sense of being part of the world around them, understanding themselves in relationships to others. Their imaginaries, and they are imaginaries, are this worldly. They're symbolically rich that draw them into relationships in this world. They tell stories that are neither about belief nor unbelief. Rather, they're stories and experiences about relationships. They are stories of spaces of becoming. They find themselves in those relationships. They find hope. They find a sense of confidence. They find love in those relationships. The dying person's vision of a predeceased relative gives them comfort and hope, not of an afterlife, but that they are not alone. The end of life care worker engages memories of those who are dying and so comforts them by being companions in the final moments of their lives. The bereaved individual experiences being heard and gains a sense of being not alone at a death cafe. The space we're describing is other or elsewhere to the religion non-religion binary. It engages with different priorities and different concerns. People who are bereaved and people who are dying both find courage and comfort in companionship, in being heard, and in being treated with dignity and respect. The religion non-religion binary largely ignores such concerns, although there are really good examples where they do. Rather, the binary tends to draw us back into questions of belief and non-belief that are largely irrelevant to the people we interviewed. We want to end by returning to two of our participants who we met earlier. Is this you, Laurie, or am I going to read?
I'll do it first, Amy. We argued that her objection was to the smug certainty of the better place comfort. So remember, Amy. You'll recall that Amy situated herself as non-religious with a rational brain, but that she was also open to the spiritual. The same openness was articulated by Kimberly, but from the other end of the spectrum, the big reveal. Kimberly identifies as Christian. And here's Kimberly. She gets to end us off. I was not religious 2 years ago, so I accidentally started going to church and accidentally started believing in God. I don't have more on that. So here I am. So I give you the space you need to tell me what your beliefs are so that I can help to discuss your beliefs in that tone or whatever. If you don't believe in God, if you hate God, then we're not going to talk about, oh, it must have been God's time, like God said it was your time. Like, that's not appropriate, right? If you believe in Mother Earth and you're more concerned of the spirit, or that's where the discussion goes, right? Usually if we're talking about end of life and they ask me, what do you think happens after death? I would say, well, what do you think? Because that's more important than what I think. So I take your cues and that's where it goes. But I do think that if my client is very religious, that's not my place. And so I have to find someone else, a minister or a priest, that fits that, because that discussion is important. You have to feel comfortable with where you are mentally before you die. Kimberly says she goes to church and believes in God. But when she accompanies a dying person, she takes her cue from their understanding of what happens when they die, of their understanding of what happens when they die. She also says she would refer a believer to a minister or a priest. It's not her place to do that work, she says. This is exactly the nature of the space of becoming. It refuses certainty, whether Christian or non-religious or religious of any other sort. Amy and Kimberly navigate the tricky waters of the in-between space of uncertainty. That this is a space that's beyond the binary of religion and non-religion, and is the space of becoming. Thank you.
So we've given ourselves the luxury of another 15 minutes. We're going to wrap up at 6:15. So that's great. And for my students, some of whom are in the room, I just want to observe, I hope you observe, that what Laurie and Doug are doing is actually something quite profound. I hope you kind of noticed it. So instead of being stuck in this religion, not religion dichotomy, they're doing something else. Remember, Laurie, when you began imagining this project, that you said, well, to see non-religion, you have to look at it obliquely. It's from a kind of a weird angle. It's off the edge of your field of vision. And I really appreciate that now that this project is really landing, producing so much rich material, that you've done that and you've shown us how we're kind of trapped in this prison of religious, non-religious. It's kind of a boring question, right? And so you're showing us how to think beyond. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks. And I mean, we admit too that we still fall into that trap on occasion.
Sure.
We can't, because that's how,
Yep.
Thank you.
That's how the discourse is built in some sense.
Yeah.
So we have time for questions. Irina.
Thank you. I was wondering, because a lot of the data from this project is about this messy place or this place of mystery and openness in between, were you having trouble at any point communicating this in quantitative terms to the stakeholders of the project, or making this information legible to people outside of the discipline who aren't used to thinking in kind of the nuances of religion and non-religion?
Yeah, thank you. We're still navigating those waters. I mean, this is really new data. This is really new. I mean, we're sort of still developing this. We've just finished a book on the community gardens project, and kind of at the last minute, to be really honest with you, when I was looking again, I've been bothered by this religion, non-religion thing for a while, and I thought we need another chapter. So I was like, okay, how do we write a chapter for a book in a couple of weeks and think about this? Because it's really difficult thinking. But we pressed on and we did it. And we're really just kind of flying this still. I mean, you're kind of a test audience in some ways. Doug, would you like to add to that? Please.
I think that's a really good question, and I think we had a bit in the paper that we didn't talk about. Or if you think of it, when people are studying ethnicity, recently the survey questions have gone to allow people to have multiple ethnicity and complex ethnicity. We don't do that in survey questions about religion, non-religion. Like, you've got a tick box, non-religion, or which religion are you? The data sources that we use edit out the complexity and the messiness. So you're right, it's really hard to communicate this. And I think it's really exciting and interesting to try and make this space. And like we keep saying, Laurie in particular keeps saying, that doesn't work, don't use that. Right? And we struggle to try and get beyond the not working. And I think that's been really valuable because it's pushed us to see this otherwise from the side. And so, yeah, good question.
Sorry.
The Western perspective tends to privilege a very particular form of consciousness, which is the rational waking, sober consciousness. And
just speak a little hot so that Doug can be sure to hear you too.
Yeah, and anything outside of the rational waking, sober consciousness tends to be just completely dismissed. And I'm wondering if you include other states of consciousness, and if so, how?
Doug, over to
you. So we haven't tried to do that yet, but then, I mean, I'm fascinated by other states of consciousness, and I've done quite a bit of work on it, and my ritual sort of studies of pagan rituals. So that's something we'll need to think more about. But how much of that we want to include in this, I'm not sure. I suspect it's doing something different. But good question. I mean, the other thing I would say is I think cross-culturally is also interesting. So, in countries that don't have monotheistic heritages, you see more of a sort of similar sort of understanding of religion?
For those, I'm going to privilege the people who aren't already around the table at the workshop. So those of you who are on the outside ring, John.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there's been any reflections in this kind of new ambiguous language in healthcare practitioner literacy, like around religion.
Can you ask the question one more time, please?
Yeah, if there's been, with the new kind of ambiguous language that's being used, if that's been reflected in healthcare practitioner
Training, more like training.
I'm
Like
not
in
as familiar
training.
with the training literature to be able to answer that, but Doug, I don't know if you are as well.
No, no, I haven't. I'm not. Yeah,
No.
maybe.
Cheryl.
Yeah.
Cheryl.
or Kobe.
Yeah. Or Kobe.
Well, I think, thank you for that question. And I do teach in nursing, as does Kobe. Kobe, there's language around what's meaningful to you, what are your goals, what are your desires, when have you felt a sense of well-being? When have you felt, what gives you strength or hope? So I think there is some vocabulary. What do you think, Kobe?
Well, I'm recalling a theory of nursing that I and others study called human becoming. So there's so much here that's resonant that would be really interesting to talk about. And there's a lot of discussion these days in relation to uncertainty, ambiguity, being present, bearing witness, those kinds of ideas.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's what we'll.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, thank you.
Good. Scott has a question from Zoom.
Along these lines, Scott asks, how do you think the space of becoming is meaningful not only to end of life, but to our work as researchers more generally? Is there a way we would like to see the imaginal, experiential, ambiguous embraced in academia?
Oh, wow. Yes. 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 I mean, the tension for me is that as a sociologist, that's one of the hats I wear. I want to stick everything in categories and then create new categories. But at the same time, I want to fight that and land in this space of becoming. And we did draw from William Conley's work in a world of becoming. And what I really like about Conley's work is his attempt to navigate this uncertainty and leave more space. The real problem, and this takes us back to, I have a lot of appreciation for the work that my colleagues do. I'm primarily a qualitative researcher, and my quantitative colleagues, I have a lot of appreciation for that work. But I think that there's a tendency to want to have a short answer, maybe like right now, a short answer, and not have complexity in answers in all kinds of realms. And the problem is the world is complex. And that's why, like Doug and I struggle. Do we include all of these long quotes? Will our audience be bored? Will our audience not want to listen? Because they're long quotes and they're not, like, all the words aren't perfect. And they don't, but we said, no, we want, this is the space of, this is what this is. So yes, I would like, that's the sort of long answer, but the shorter answer is yes, I would like to see a greater embracing of a more complex articulation of the social world in all disciplines, really, and collaboration between disciplines to insist that disciplinary boundaries need to be made more complex and blurry, even if we keep them and appreciate what disciplines offer. So that's a whole other conversation. Doug?
I think this is a more general theme. I think that part of the challenge that we face now as the human race is the desire to resist simple answers and to learn to live with our fears and anxieties and complexity. So I think it's a much broader theme, and that's part of the reason that I'm passionate about it.
Shubham.
Thank you so much. So, space of becoming, but I'm curious if you can talk about how your study is accounting for the presence of being. What do I mean by that? The background of these death doulas, or their religious background or cultural background, or with this immigration thing, people from non-Christian background are also coming and becoming the death doulas. So how their ideas of religion is reflected in this sort of care,
Mhm.
if you've come across any such.
Yeah,
into
Doug,
being.
do you want to comment on that, or do you want me to?
Can someone repeat the question for me? I didn't quite hear the words.
He's, do you mind?
No, please go for it.
Shubham was wondering if a person who comes from away, let's say from a Hindu or Buddhist background, they come from Thailand or India, and they come and they settle in Canada and they become a death doula here, and they're kind of operating within this discursive space of meaning, of becoming. And do they then simply take on this kind of ambiguity, this kind of ambiguous language, or are they somehow, or would one expect to see echoes of their ontological orientations from their upbringing still showing up in these kinds of reflections? Is that about right?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm like a Shubham translator.
See, my guess is that a lot of people from non-monotheistic backgrounds are already doing a lot of this stuff. So, like I did some interesting, I read as many as I could find of the contemporary English language ethnographies on Japanese religions. And, there's incredible diversity in the way that they engage with things. They're not, like the myth is you're born a Shinto, get married a Christian, and then die Buddhist. Like they move between the religious traditions in a way of trying to find the thing that works for them. I don't know whether Hindus and people from other religious backgrounds do that, but I suspect that there's already a lot of flexibility. And even we could talk more about Latin American, South American, forms of Catholicism. There's huge variety and complexity in that. So I suspect a lot of people are already doing that. I suspect it's the resisting of the certainty that goes with particularly Christian, but potentially also other forms of monotheism.
Thanks, Doug. One thing, just at a methodological level, I kind of think I know how you're going to answer this question, but I kind of want to see how you do it. One thing, that's a wrong way to introduce it. Yeah.
I'm going to set you up here.
No. So I began by reflecting on how much I appreciate how you're trying to break out of the binary of religious, non-religious. And in a sense, it kind of reminds me a little bit of the introduction of a lived religion paradigm framework orientation into the study of religion, where similarly one was trying to break out of the categories of, well, what you need to know about a Lutheran is that she thinks this, what you need to know about a Jew is she eats that, believes that. And focusing on lived religion, like how being a Lutheran matters to her life, or how being a Jew matters to her life. But I wonder if in some sense you're doing a little bit of that, if this is a kind of a lived dying approach or a lived death orientation, where you're trying to sort of see how does it actually work in this actual person's life. And when you look at it that way, you don't see the clear, belief, not belief, or, religion, not religion.
Yeah, there is some of that going on. I think. By the way, I think it was Peter Beyer first sort of started talking about lived non-religion, but I feel like that's another thing to be resisted in the sense that we're really trying to reside in the space in between where we're not pulling us back to the binary. And I think we're looking at the space in between. So I think it's not a bad thing to make that analogy, Paul, even if it's not quite where we're going, but it's the insistence of moving outside of the expected, the ideological dogma or whatever it might be, to say, we need to look at what people actually do and what they're actually saying and the actual struggles on the ground in everyday life, if you will. Rather than just making assumptions. Doug?
I think you've said it well, Laurie, and I like the way that Paul articulated it. It's our focus is on the practice and on what people are doing and trying to be empirical about that.
Okay, so we have about a minute and a half left. Java has a question that he's going to articulate in a haiku.
Simple and a tricky question though. Do you think the non-religion thing itself is emerging as a religion?
No.
Doug.
Wow, that's impressive.
Doug.
Yeah, no, I think you said it all, Laurie.
think the point is they're trying to avoid that. They're trying to avoid that altogether. So to say it's emerging as a religion would be to play into that binary again.
I love it when you channel me, Paul.
I see how where all the power comes from.
So I want to follow up out of respect to your question, because I think it's a really good question. It's a powerful question. The reason it is because there's this huge pull to religion-like. And as I always ask, what do we gain by that? There's something else happening. And I do think, it sounds like, blame the Christians again, but there's a way in which we live in a society that has until very recently, and perhaps still is, hegemonically Christian, influenced by Christianity. And so there are certain frameworks, there are ways that we think, and again, going back to, I think it was David who used residually Christian, the ways in which that pulls us towards saying things in particular ways or thinking about things in particular ways. Sometimes that can be good, and sometimes that might not be so good. But again, what is gained by saying something is religion-like? What do we learn by saying that? And I want to resist it. I want to say that's not the space I want to go. I want to go and use, as Paul channeled me perhaps better than I'm doing myself right now. It's that space in between of resisting that religion-like. So not having religion always be the referent, and to resist and say, well, what is actually happening here? Is there such a thing as a non-religious soul? What the heck does that mean? Or do we need to speak in that way? Or what do we mean when we talk about soul? And just asking those questions, not in a way that's necessarily normatively attached, although just about everything is. So, but in a way that is a kind of exploration, a social scientific exploration, if you will. What is it exactly we're talking about? And it's a difficult space. It's a space that is very difficult to describe, but also a difficult space to reside in sometimes, because people want to articulate where they are, and they're using the social cues and frameworks and toolkits that they have, and that they can't always say exactly what it is they mean, if that makes sense. Doug, I don't think I said that very well. Do you want to add to that?
No, I think that the way that you've said it works well. We want to resist being drawn back into the binary. Yeah.
But it's hard.
Yeah. All right. That's a good question to end on. Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you.
So next week, March 20th, the architecture of anxiety, body politics, and the formation of Islamic architecture. Our distinguished lecture in Islam is happening. So this is also, it's in a different room. It's in the Hickman building, A110. And it's also in a somewhat extended time frame. Okay. So thanks everyone for coming out today. Those of you who are part of the workshop will come back here tomorrow after dinner tonight. And thanks very much, everyone. And those of you on Zoom, this is being recorded and will be posted on our website sometime soonish. Thanks, everyone.